Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, friends, participants to the INREM conference. Last week, we all witnessed the COP26 in Glasgow, and we all saw our world leaders in agreement that today's global problems require bold global solutions. One of these solutions that most participants seemed to agree upon was that of landscape restoration. And the most striking target that I heard was that in the next 10 years, about 1 billion hectares is to be restored by planting 1 trillion trees, and that would then require about $10 trillion to be derived from public and particularly private sector. What delighted me was that besides this agreement on the need for restoration, the landscape approach was generally agreed to be the best way to tackle this, because there seems to be general agreement that a landscape approach is a landscape is the best level for handling difficult trade-offs. However, within all this agreement, there are still quite some questions remaining, and those questions I would like to resume them by saying, well, where actually to restore? What needs to restore, and how does this restoration need to happen, and who actually takes the decision as to what to restore, where and how? That brings me to the topic of my story, that is landscape governance. That's also my own favorite topic. And I was delighted to hear so much talk about governance during COP. Apparently, landscape governance is considered to be the new silver bullet to balance production and consumption and protection within single spaces. Simply by engaging stakeholders and bringing them into partnerships or platforms and to negotiate and take wonderful decisions. But how does this really work? Well, that brings me to the outcomes of research that I carried out over the past 10 years, which I would like to share with you. This research is all about landscape governance. It's about landscape governance in terms of substance, that is, the landscape and all the processes that are taking place there, but also regarding the process, that is the process of actors getting together into some sort of a governance process. Within these two, the substance and the processes, I looked at which are the challenges that are generally encountered in such landscape governance, and how do we or how do stakeholders overcome these challenges, and which are actually the capabilities that they need to have to do so. All right, talk about my research. I researched a couple of cases, and in all these cases was not necessarily the best landscape governance, but I did witness some sort of landscape governance taking place. One was in Southwest Amazon in Latin America, at the frontier between Bolivia, Brazil, and Peru. There I found an interesting example of transboundary landscape governance, that is, people in 3 adjacent countries crossing the border and joining hands into a civic-led process of governance. And that process actually was manifested in a massive process of transboundary social learning. I also worked quite a bit in Indonesia's West Kalimantan, where I found interesting landscape governance arrangements within the palm oil landscapes. And I saw private-led governance arrangements in the form of multifunctional concession design. And a third example that I encountered was in Rwanda, in Africa, East Africa, in one district quite close to the capital of Kigali, where a most densely populated landscape was actually shaped by a public-led governance and public actors guiding a process of balancing food security with reforestation and economic growth. Well, based on all these cases, again, not necessarily the best cases, but real cases, I could define landscape governance, and I'm challenging you, please redefine, because definitions need to be challenged. My definition is that landscape governance is a place-based, multi-level and multi-stakeholder process of negotiation and decision-making for sustainable land use, which attempts to balance the production, the protection, and the consumption needs of those actors involved. Okay, based on that definition, I studied these cases, and a couple of more cases, by the way, and I found out that landscape governance does not know one ideal typical mode of governance. It can be manifested in multiple modes. It can be manifested in governance arrangements, yes, but that could be public arrangements, private arrangements, civic arrangements, or all sort of combinations between these. And what I realized is that all these arrangements, they tend to overlap, to coexist, multiple types of arrangements, even within a single landscape, happening at the same time. And moreover, they tend to shift over time. Now, these shifts of modes of governance seem to be quite in accordance with larger societal shifts. I mentioned a few, the general shift from single to multi-actor governance, which is happening in these 3 places, but many more places in the world. It tends to follow the drivers of degradation, and it tends to follow the solutions of these drivers of degradation. It tends to follow democratization and decentralization taking place anyway. And that's probably the most striking, it tends to follow the global restoration discourse, which has been taking shape over the past few years, and finally then sees the light in the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. This process is challenging. It's positively challenging, also negatively challenging. I encountered quite a couple of challenges. I encountered substantive challenges. That's what I would consider the challenges that are directly related to the landscape itself, its ecosystem functions, its ecosystem services. But I also found challenges in relation to the process. That's the process of governance that take place. So on the one hand, the substantive challenges that challenge landscape governance, but then the landscape part of it, and the process challenges that challenge the governance part of landscape governance. I've been looking for causes underneath these challenges, and in both the process and the substantive challenges, I found that a fundamental cause is institutional. It's related to a skill mismatch. It's related to the fact that landscapes as socio-ecological systems hardly ever match with jurisdictions. Boundaries are different. Jurisdictional boundaries and landscape boundaries, they hardly ever coincide. That places place-based institutions and hierarchies versus administrative hierarchies. And that creates friction, that clashes. Nevertheless, I saw a lot of landscape arrangements happening, emerging, taking shape, led by coalitions of people on the ground. I call these landscape arrangements place-based arrangements because they're connected to places. They're place-based, they're socially accepted. Multiple stakeholders take part in processes of dialogue, struggle, negotiation, and finding agreements, at least partial. They tend to lead, or at least aim to lead, to more ecologically sustainable landscapes. However, very often, the cases that I found, at least, they remain to be informal, and that's part of the strength. It's the informality that makes them strong embedded in society, but it's also their weakness, because by this informality, they tend to stay what we call in the shadow of hierarchy. They tend to be left alone by formal spatial decision-making. They tend to be super good, but increasingly or all the time lacking the formal legitimacy that they would need to be actually taken seriously and implemented and enforced. Stakeholders know this. They know that they do a lot of great things, but they remain in informality, in the shadow of hierarchy. But they're clever. They're doing things. They're developing strategies to overcome this informality. And I saw two types of strategies. One type of strategy were horizontal. They were, you see that on the bottom part of the graph. You see local farmers, herders, citizens, creatively blending customs and traditions and existing rules with contemporary rules. And with that, they tend to find all sort of creative, integrated forms of land use, which are good for people, which are good for the land. And with this, they by all means fit in and try to comply with the rules. Imagine you don't break the rules, right? I also found vertical strategies, and vertical strategies are not so much combining land uses within a landscape, but they're rather seeking for strategic networks and connections across hierarchies and across spaces of decision-making. Now, within these vertical strategies, that's interesting. I see a lot of creativeness. I saw stakeholders crafting new institutions. And with these new institutions that stretch multiple spaces or multiple hierarchies, even sectors, they tend to not just comply with the rules, but to stretch the rules, to enlarge the rules, to create room for innovation. And with that, they tend to transform the rules. Now, that is what I found super interesting. And that is what I would call landscape governance. In this way, I would call landscape governance as a way to bridge the skill divide, between the jurisdictional hierarchies on the one hand, and on the other hand, the social spatial reality of places where people feel they belong, and they own, and they know. Landscape governance then, as a means to bridge the skill divide, is led by creative and entrepreneurial actors, local actors, not exclusively local, also other actors, but actors who are creative enough to find ways to do what they want to do. I call then landscape governance a sort of a set of place-based governance arrangements. And you can see them on the right side, different committees, partnerships, initiatives, commitments, you know, that bridge the skill divide. And very often these arrangements, they start in the informal, but over time, through the strategies, the horizontal and the vertical strategies employed by actors, they gain legitimacy, as these are step by step legitimized, maybe not by law, but by the social acceptance of a landscape's inhabitants and the sustainability of the landscape itself. Through this process, I see power moving away from mainstream politics and moving towards places in the hands of people who own, who belong to a particular place. So that makes me conclude that landscape governance is is a means to reconnect people and their place. Having said this, I would like to move to the capabilities that all this requires, because within all these beautiful, innovative, challenging arrangements that I found, I realized that actors need to be very capable to craft these arrangements. Capable in terms of substantive capabilities, that is the knowledge, the experience of their landscape, the local knowledge, the technical knowledge, what's going on in my place and how do I manage that well, but also the process capabilities. How do I create and maintain this process of stakeholder interaction and social learning? And on top of that, it requires institutional capabilities, probably the most difficult, the connecting of institutions, the transforming in institutions, which is not easy. It's the capability, I would say, to do things differently, to arrange, to govern your landscape differently. It's the ability to think out of the box, to be creative and have the guts to launch processes together with others. This is something that cannot be acquired through teaching or training. It's not a capability that is taught in our universities. It's something that actors learn by doing. It's something that they do collectively through daily practice. Now, this capability, this landscape governance capability, is, I would say, not an individual capability. It's a capability of a group of landscape actors in their collectiveness. And by having these meta capabilities, they are in the position to make system-wide change. Okay, phew, that's not easy. And I wonder, be seriously, what does this all mean for us? We are universities, you are university teachers, I am university teacher. What does this all mean for us? Do we equip our students with the capabilities that they need to start and act and maintain landscape governance? Do we really deliver the landscape professionals of the future who are able to guide these processes, to steer these processes together with those stakeholders they're going to meet in their professional lives? And maybe we have to do a bit better in order to deliver these landscape professionals of the future by equipping them with the capabilities that they need. Okay, let me remind, because you may have already forgotten, I made a distinguish between substantive capabilities, process capabilities, and institutional capabilities. And throughout the research, I actually did quite some large-scale capability needs assessment. Now, thinking about these needs that I assessed, but moving to the ways in which we, as universities, can satisfy these needs, I believe there is the need for us to move from classroom teaching to competence-based learning. And competence-based learning, that entails to move away from disciplinary silos to those interdisciplinary curricula that enable our students to get multiple knowledges and skills and attitudes and combine these. We could, I think we could achieve these by being more creative in organizing our courses, our curricula, our individual lessons, but also our internships, so offering students more opportunities to carry out internships, research projects, follow capstone courses, do all sort of electives for them to pick and choose and combine and craft their own curriculum that fits their needs. I think we like to ask students and then they're supposed to answer. But I think we have to learn our students to ask the right questions, not just answering these. That's something we've got to be better in, I think. And that means that we should learn our students to think out of the box, not only now that they're young, but throughout their professional lives, and keep challenging them to keep thinking out of new boxes they'll be captured in. Okay, having said that, I would like to share maybe one thing that we're doing at Wageningen. At Wageningen, we strongly believe in what we call the T-shape professional. And then the T-shape professional stands for the letter T. And the letter T, as you see on the slide, it's a professional or an alumnus that is strongly rooted in a particular discipline, but on top of that has a more general, a more holistic overview of what needs to be done in a landscape. So we don't push students away from their disciplinary core, but from that disciplinary core, we push them to open their minds and to explore other disciplines so that they can maneuver and navigate between sectors and so also actors, and in future also the skills. I think with this, if I go back to the Glasgow conference and the UN Decade on ecosystem restoration, there is a need for these T-shaped landscape professionals who stick out their necks, who have the guts to do things differently, and who can change the world. So let's nurture the landscape professional of the future. Thank you.